Hey, what is going on everybody, and welcome to Fantasia. For today, we're going to be jumping into another session of Epic 7L today. Got another balance adjustment for you guys. So this time around, we're going to be taking a look at changes to 7 heroes and 2 artifacts. And, well, here's the list, and look at who's topping that list. That's right. Pirate Captain Flan. So let's go ahead and jump into it right away and start immediately with... Wait, is this it? Alright, so Pirate Captain Flan is going to be getting some minor changes. Yeah, so her S1 basically got changed from a 75% chance to steal a buff to a 100% chance to steal a buff. Fantastic. Should have been like that to begin with, honestly. It really helps her be able to kind of take away the immunity from the opponent. Immunity is something that absolutely shuts her down. The issue with this, though, is that stealing one buff is usually not enough, because immunity is usually safeguarded by a bunch of other buffs, right? You guys might be aware of the protection set immunity buff stacking. So if you have someone on immunity set and you run a unit on protection set, they get a barrier at the start of the match along with their immunity. If you try to strip the first buff in RTA, it will always strip the barrier and immunity will be protected. Same thing with if you have stealth and immunity and a barrier and stuff like that, right? The barrier gets stripped and the stealth and the immunity. So immunity is really well protected. And stealing one buff really isn't going to cut it. Long term, it might, but we'll talk about that moving forward into the rest of her kit. It used to be that in the previous buff that was proposed, she would have had the ability to give everyone on her team the pillage buff. The pillage buff would have allowed everyone to start stealing buffs from the opponent, which is pretty cool, right? But unfortunately, they're not going along with that here. Instead, they are just tweaking her passive ever so slightly. Instead of redirecting 30% of the damage that she suffers to the caster in the front, then they're changing that to just a 30% damage mitigation here, damage reduction, right? So this damage reduction does not stack with things like Adamant Shield, things like Albedo's passive, stuff of that sort, right? Crimson Armand's passive, it does not stack. But you can stack this with something like Aureus, which is cool. You used to not be able to stack this with Aureus. This is not bad. However, I would argue that her getting the anti-crit buff in the previously proposed update was so much better. I really wish they kind of kept that, even if it was just a symbolic reference to her connection with Navy Captain Landy, right? It would have been really cool to see. Instead, you know, people were really not happy with the balance proposal, I guess I should say, the balance proposal that they had previously, that they're really just walking this back. I kind of had a feeling, right? I did say in the last balance patch where they recalled her update that they would try again, and they are, but this is really just a shadow of what she could have been, and this is honestly a little disappointing. Now, the other thing here is that, and I guess the only real change is her ability to combat readiness push by 15% is changed from 2 turns to 3 turns. They increased it because now the condition is, instead of whenever the caster has a buff, whenever she attacks with a buff, now it's after any ally attacks, anyone on your team. If the target does not have a buff on your opponent's side, she gets to activate Hunt, and she boosts the combat readiness of everyone by 15%. The main thing that comes to mind here is you can use her now with any units that can strip. Not non-attack units, so not like C. Lilius or C. Phantom Politis, stuff like that. Has to be a unit that attacks. You could potentially get a combat readiness push by, let's say, using Knockwell's S3, stripping everything, right? But the main usage people are probably going to be using her for is a bridge unit with Zeo, right? Zeo guarantees you first turn, even with Harsetti on the other side. You attack with Zeo's S2, you strip 2 buffs from your opponent, most likely leaving them with no buffs. Then Pirate Captain Flan gets to push up your team by 15%. Pretty cool, right? But this is, and I'll talk about this in the summary at the end of the video, but this is something that I'm not too big of a fan of, honestly, because the design of a lot of units now are just really revolving. They're consolidating these units and their support skills to be used with a very select few number of units, right? The Zeos, the Harsettis, the C Phantom Politises of the meta, and it makes it so that if you don't have those units, you're really going to struggle with applying these buffs in practice, and we'll see that a lot happen later on down here. So Pirate Captain Flan, in my opinion, not great, honestly. It is a one tiny, like, half step forward in terms of a buff for her. I really wish she got her previous buff, and a lot of people starting to have some regrets about complaining about her previous buff, because it was pretty good. It was pretty good, and now we have, well, we have this, so... Anyway, moving on. Sorry, Pirate Captain Flan, you are not the star of today's balance update. Next up, we have Closer Charles. So, Closer Charles actually gets a small minor tweak. He becomes a better bruiser, essentially. His S1 now is life steals. It absorbs some of the damage dealt as health, but they did increase his damage as well. So, you know what? Not too bad, right? Demolition, by the way, is his different, the one that has a different animation. It's like Earth Charles is like S2, right? So it's not just his normal attack. It's if he has perception, if he has his perception buff, he will have this extra animation, right, for him. So that attack gets his damage increased, which is not bad, and he gets some life steal. Okay, it's not terrible. It just helps him survive a bit longer. The issue with him, though, is that his evasion buff was, you know, something that you really need to keep up, and they kind of realized that. So, with his passive, they gave him, at the start of the first battle, increased evasion for 1 turn. It's cool. Gets 50% evasion. He usually has an artifact that gives him 20% more, so you start the match with 70% evasion. Still 30% chance to get royally destroyed, but, hey, still better than nothing, right? Now, the other thing is that his S3 gives an evasion buff for 2 turns as well, so you can just keep evasion up for quite a while, and his turn cycling is going to be improved a little bit too, because instead of the opponent reaching less than 30% health, now your condition to push up combat readiness is if the opponent's health is less than 40%, which is much easier to achieve. Again, really easy to achieve if you have units like Zio, for example. When Zio S3s, he basically takes the opponent down to 50% health, assuming they don't have mitigation or any defense penetration resistance on their team. So again, really synergizes well, right? And with those types of units that do a chunk of damage early on. But he is also now a pretty good bridge unit, again, another good bridge unit for these aggressive cleave comps, right? Especially because Closer Charles' S3 also cannot proc counter attacks, which makes him pretty good into things that might potentially counter, right? Navy Captain Landy's, Abyssal Yufines, those like common, or I guess I should say slightly more common, right, anti-cleave choices on the opponent's side. So Closer Charles, looking pretty decent. Will this absolutely fix him? I don't think so. It just makes him a bit more consistent with proccing his passive, which is kind of nice. Alright, moving on here though, we have Archdemon Shadow. So this unit here is, oh man, she got overshadowed quite a bit, no pun intended, by Knockwall. So she used to have a 75% chance to seal the enemy for 2 turns. They finally increased it to a 100% chance, and her soul burn is now just ignore effect resistance. It used to increase the chance to 100% and ignore resistance, but you know, what she was before was if you didn't have a soul burn, she was just garbage, and you're running the risk of not sealing. So now she's more consistent at what she's doing. They also kind of adapted this this extra attack here. So this is her passive, right? So after using a basic skill now, when the target is sealed, she will increase attack of herself for 1 turn and then activate Burst. Burst is her extra attack, which has all those spikes and stuff. It's an AoE attack, right? And increases her combat readiness. But whenever she has a successful attack now, it will deal additional damage that's proportional to her attack stat, which is cool. Synergizes with the attacks buff that she'll get here. Synergizes with the fact that, well, she's very consistent now in applying seals, right? Especially if you build her with a little bit of effectiveness, you can probably seal most units in the meta pretty easily. And yeah, it's not bad. Burst damage has also had its damage dealt decreased, which is something to keep in mind. But again, that extra damage proc is probably going to make your overall damage output much higher than it was before. So this is also really important. So this extra damage that's proportional to the caster's attack, this is kind of like a Ubir's Tooth situation, right? Karina's Rocket Punch Gauntlet or a 3F, right, from Albedo. Those artifacts where you can chip down units that have like damage limit buffs and stuff on them. So this is a good way to kind of counter those units. Think about units not like Sylvan Sage Vivian that can reduce damage that's taken, right? Midnight God Lilius, those types of things. So this is a pretty good way to chip down those units when they're trying to mitigate most of the damage that you're dealing. And this also makes it so that you don't really have to build her with crit rate and crit damage. You can just build her with a lot of attack, and she'll be pretty consistent with dealing damage overall. Okay, so moving on though, she now has a 80% chance to decrease defense for 2 turns on her S3, increased from a 70% chance, which is, you know, not bad. Instead of a 7 in 10 chance, now you have an 8 in 10 chance. Any percent chance to defense break is solid, especially, keep in mind, this is an AoE defense break, right? For reference, Briarwitch, Iceria, a Tywin's defense breaks on their S3s, they have an 85% chance to defense break, right? So this is pretty much just bringing her up to par with the rest of the units that have AoE defense breaks here. Archdemon, I think, is pretty solid. She's going to be more consistent. Is she going to be better than Knockwall? It really depends. If you build a Knockwall that's slower and tankier, and you can probably get away with like most of the stuff that Archdemon does and then some with like resets, because Knockwall's pretty good at turn cycling too for the team. Archdemon does have the advantage in that she is pretty easy to build, bulkier. You can build her with just attack now, no crit damage needed. You can still rely just on soul burns to ignore res and stuff, but maybe a little bit of effectiveness could go a long way, especially with her consistency and sealing. And then her defense break chance, everything just points to building her with some damage. She can chip the opponent down. You can also stack the successful attack damage here. You can stack it, because she's a mage, with Fairy Tale for a Nightmare, Fairy Tale Tenebr's Artifact, which will deal extra damage, right, with extra attacks. So this is a pretty good way to boost Archdemon's damage output. I think she'll be seen. Whether or not she's going to be super good is yet to be determined, right? You're going to have to see how people use her and what they use her into, because right now we're in a really aggressive meta. People are playing pretty fast. People are playing pretty high damage units right now. So she is going to struggle a little bit, and I do hope that she does find her spot, because I do want to use her. I do really want to use her. She seems like a really good unit for like a standard v standard matchup, right? Sealing Blood Moon Haste and units on the other side, Empyrean Elenovs and such. I think that'll be really, really strong for her. She's going to have a niche for sure. All right, moving forward, we have Eligos. So he is a unit that has seen a couple of reworks in the past. Now, he used to give himself perception, right? And now they're taking that kind of stipulation away from his S1. Now he'll dual attack with the highest attack ally when he has an increased attack greater attack buff. Okay, and they actually decrease the damage that he deals with this S1, which is fine. He's not really doing too much with his S1 in terms of damage, but now, of course, he has a greater attack buff, way more damage than getting a perception buff, right? His passive now includes this increased hit chance. It used to be that when you S3'd, he'll get this buff. It's dispellable that increases hit chance of the caster for 2 turns. Now they're like, you know what, let's just build it into his kit. He can hit any ice unit now that he wants, it's whatever. And screw evasion units too, by the way. So crit damage is also increased by 50%. That's huge. Getting free 50% crit damage is insane. For reference, nobody else has ever gotten an increased critical hit damage as just a passive flat stat increase. And this is pretty much almost just a free destruction set on him, which is nuts, right? It really lowers the gear threshold that you need on him in terms of damage. You can build him much faster now too. Okay, now, whenever an ally on your team defeats an enemy, right, eliminates them from the match, then he activates Time Bomb against the enemy with the lowest health. It used to be he'll activate it against the enemy with the highest attack. And that wasn't always the most optimal, right? When you're going aggressive, when you're cleaving, you really want to just clean up these lower health units. And Eligos here is now going to be very consistent in targeting the lowest health unit. We'll get to the targeting highest attack unit in a bit. And his Time Bomb is the one that will grant him this greater attack buff for 2 turns. It's nuts. That's an insane... If you guys have ever seen Arby get a Gab, you know that's an insane buff here. And then his damage dealt also increases proportional to his own speed, right? Which is kind of cool. Instead of having to, deal damage with the difference between his speed and the target speed, right? Now it's just based on his own speed, which is pretty cool. And they increase the damage that's dealt here as well. His S3, Cloak and Dagger, now inflicts resource reduction on the target by 60%. Finally, another resource reduction unit outside of like what Falconer Clury and like Zahak's EE, right? So this is pretty good. He got rid of the hit chance here. They kind of put it into his passive, but now this resource reduction is really important because by doing this, right, he does this before attacking the enemy. They basically made him a Fire Flan counter. You can resource reduction, the Fire Flan, so she starts the batch with 3 focus, right? 60% is just enough to take 3 focus away from Fire Flan, so she starts with 0 focus, which means she loses the extra 50% evasion, and guess what? Eligos has an increased hit chance of 50%, which means he will always be able to hit Fire Flan. You can no longer use Fire Flan as kind of a high evasion, bulky lifesteal unit or whatever. As an anti-cleave type of unit, you can't really use her in those situations. Eligos now, hey, if your opponent goes first and they have an Eligos pop off, your Flan is dead. They did decrease the damage that was dealt here by the S3, but it really doesn't matter because most of the time you're going to be using his S3 after you use your S2, right? Some person opens up for the team and then you get to go and, you know, probably clean up some units. Now, you could build him super fast. You could open with him, right? If you open with him, let's say you do, you can actually just honestly just attack Fire Flan. He's probably going to kill, right? Fire Flan's not as tanky as most other units out there for bruiser teams, so even though the damage dealt is decreased, I'm sure he will kill. If he kills, that's fantastic, right? And then you get to set up, okay, for your other units to go, right? You probably have some bridge units and stuff going on too. Now, they kept the rest of the stuff the same. The other thing is that he actually increases the combat readiness of himself by 50%. So here's the ideal scenario, right? You open up, you use your S3, you kind of kill Fire Flan or something else on the other side. If you don't kill, it's fine. You dispel 2 buffs from the target, and you decrease defense and their combat readiness, and right, you're basically making them super vulnerable. Let's say you inflict this, you know, debuff, the defense break, let's say you didn't kill somebody, right? And then you get the 50% combat readiness. Whoever's going next is probably going to clean up, okay? And when they clean up, you're going to, 1, proc this, right? Which is going to attack the unit with the lowest health. You're probably going to deal a ton of damage. If you're building with high damage, he's probably going to kill something as well on the other side. If he doesn't kill, it doesn't matter, because now you're probably going to be taking the turn really quickly afterwards, because you just got 50% combat readiness. You're now going to S1 with a greater attack buff, and then you're going to dual attack with the ally with the highest attack, and you're just going to absolutely massacre your opponent, right? So he is going to be a very consistent unit, and a very scary unit for a lot of teams. You can't even use him, you can even use him into just like standard like evasion units out there, right? Think of things like Savior Aiden, common anti-cleave unit at times, right? Can really punish squishy teams. Not anymore, not anymore. And Eligos actually had a couple of EE changes, right? I think Eligos is one of the big winners of this balance patch so far. So at the start of the first battle, he, instead of granting stealth to caster for 1 turn, it now grants him stealth for 2 turns. So now he's not even touchable, right? When he gets that first S3 off, right, if he's fast, let's say he gets the first S3 off, he gains the 50% combat readiness. He's still stealth after his first turn. You can't touch him. Okay, that's going to increase his survivability by a ton, pretty much guaranteeing that he's probably going to S1 on the next turn, right? And then dual attack. It used to be that Eligos rarely got that dual attack off because he usually died before he was able to take its second turn. So this is kind of good for him. And then instead of decrease the cooldown of his S3 by 1 turn, they now increase the damage dealt by Time Bomb by 10%, and instead of attacking the enemy with the lowest health, he'll attack the enemy with the highest attack. Right, so they kind of said like, hey, you know, if you still like your old Eligos effect here, we're going to give you the option to choose between the two. In my opinion, I think most people are just going to stick with the lowest HP one. It's really good to be able to consistently pick off your opponent's units rather than try to gamble and deal a bunch of damage to the highest attack unit, which might not even be the best priority unit to be attacking, by the way. So yeah, Eligos, pretty cool. Can't wait to get absolutely destroyed by him in the near future. So that's something to look out for. All right, next up, we have Chloe. Chloe, now, with her Magic Bolt attack, she's going to increase the attack of the cast for 3 turns after... so this is going to be before she attacks, right? After increasing the attack of the cast for 3 turns, she attacks the enemy, then inflicts the Magic Nail. That's actually pretty big. It increases her damage output by a ton. Okay, now Magic Nail has also been changed. Before it was that whoever had it will suffer damage equivalent to 2% of their max health, and they have a 25% chance to be stunned for 1 turn. The stun ignores effect resistance. That was mostly a PvE thing. People used Chloe in like Wyvern teams, right? But now Magic Nail says when attacked, when whoever has the debuff is attacked, it inflicts damage, additional damage proportional to the attacker's attack. And guess what? Chloe now gives herself an attack buff before she attacks, so this is huge. This is some good synergy, okay? Yeah, so it's not bad. This is going to be a lot of splash damage. This is going to be, you know, hit onto that target, and I still think she might be just a PvE unit. We'll get into it in a second. Her Hyper Strike, this skill has actually been changed too. So instead of damage dealt is increased when the enemy is inflicted with the magic nail, specifically, it says when the enemy is inflicted with the magic nail, then it just ignores effect resistance, right? This stun is going to be guaranteed, which is nice. And then they just decrease the damage dealt here, probably because, well, they give her an increased attack buff, so they're kind of compensating. I'm pretty sure her overall damage output is going to be higher than it was before, though. Okay, but again, we need to wait for multipliers and stuff to see. Chloe here, people have been theorizing that she is going to be a unit that's usable in the upcoming Rift. We had a Fire Rift, we had an Earth Rift. That's right, upcoming one would probably be an Ice Rift, and Chloe is a good PvE unit with a very unique debuff. So, hey, if you have a Chloe laying around, don't just imprint all of them into a Maid Chloe. Make sure to keep one copy of every unit around at all times. You know, it might put them in the waiting room or something, but when the time comes you need them, you can go ahead and use Grace of Growth on them, and then use them in the content that's required, right? Smilegate has been consistently going down this this path of requiring players to have very specific units to tackle very specific scenarios, even for limited time events, right? For example, Hall of Trials. So yeah, keep your units, keep one copy of every unit around. You don't need to imprint your Chloe, right? But just keep a copy of Chloe around, and that applies for any unit, 3, 4, and 5 star. Okay, so her EEs have actually been adjusted too. So instead of increasing attack of caster for 2 turns when using the magic bolt, that was kind of applied into her kit, she now increases the combat readiness of herself by 15% when using the heavy strike skill. And then her other EE here was to dispel all buffs from the enemy when using magic bolt. Now that's just increasing damage dealt by hyper strike by 20%. And the third EE, instead of decreasing the enemy's defense for 2 turns when using hyper strike, now she has a 75% chance to decrease defense for 2 turns when using Hyper Strike. But when the target is inflicted with Magic Nail, she ignores effect resistance. I'm a little iffy on this one, right? They basically took this 100% chance of defense break, they gave it ignore effect resistance, but then they decreased this chance to 85%. So really nothing changed, because, I mean, I guess, you don't have to build her with effectiveness like this, right? But then here, you can still get 15%, and Smilegate loves 15% for no reason. But now, even though you ignore res, you can still get 15%. It's absolutely insane. Yeah, I mean, come on, guys. She's a PvE unit. Just let her have that 100% chance of defense break. Let her runs be a bit more consistent. They really don't like that. Alright, moving on. Let's see what Yufine has in store for us here. So Yufine has a 70% chance defense break, defense break for 2 turns now, which is insane, by the way. This is on her Dragon's Roar. It's her S2. It's an AoE skill. And then you can soul burn this to ignore effect resistance. Now, again, this is fair, right? It's a AoE defense break. Ignoring res on that it's kind of a big deal, right? So I can see why it's not a 100% chance here. You rarely have a 100% chance of defense break on units that have an AoE. I think there's only one unit that does have it. I think Briarwitch is not 100%, A-Time is not 100%. I forget who does, but there's like one unit that has a 100% chance. Oh, it is Dragon King Sharoon. Dragon King Sharoon has a 100% chance of defense break on her AoE S3, but that's only against like Soul Weavers and Knights, which is probably why they gave it a 100% chance, right? But yeah, Yufine here, 70% chance, pretty good. Defense break is very nice. Now, her Dragon Charge, so this is her S3, she now increases her attack for 2 turns before she attacks the enemy, and when the enemy is defeated, she grants an extra turn, which is cool. When the skill is available, after an ally except for the caster uses any skill, if the enemy has a debuff, it increases combat readiness of the caster by 20%. So this is kind of buff what she used to have. She was the original, before Jacko was released, she was the original Zeo bridge unit. So you'd open with Zeo, you S3, you silence somebody, and then it pushes up Yufine by 20%. She will go ahead and S3, and if the target was silenced, she'll penetrate their defense by 70%. Well, guess what? Silence is a really rare debuff to come across, and Zeo was really the only unit that could work with her. Jacko is just way more versatile because Jacko worked with any debuff. Well, they're doing that with Yufine now. But Yufine's cool thing is she actually just has to have the unit use a skill. So she can actually be used with things like C. Lilius, ML Politis, ML Luna, right? As long as the enemy has a debuff after a unit uses a skill on your side, it could be a non-attack skill, right? She will gain that 20% combat readiness, which makes her really scary. They're definitely pushing her in the direction of PvP, and I'll talk about why I'm saying that, even though her kit here looks like it's made for PvP in just 1 second. So yeah, that's the main thing here. The other thing is that they actually changed her imprint concentration, which is nuts. The imprint change, instead of just imprinting into attack, now she's imprinting into crit rate, which is the best DPS imprint you can possibly get. Up to 17, almost 17% crit rate. That is 4 mid rolls, right? Or a little bit over 3 max rolls for crit rate. That is really good. This means that it'll free up the crit chance that you'll need. You can put the stats into attack if you really want it. Attack is much easier to roll than crit rate. And you can also put it into things like speed. You can put into things like bulk if you want to build her a bit bulkier. She's going to be a lot more versatile, pretty scary. Now, the main thing people are upset about here is that people do use Yufine in Labyrinth. And you can use her in Labyrinth to farm the Labyrinth coins. And they abuse that with the fact that she can actually have an EE here that extends the buff durations for her S1, right? And you normally don't want her to turn cycle and take extra turns here, which they kind of did. They gave her that, which is not great. So yeah, that is one thing that people are kind of upset about, is that she won't really work. I don't know if she can still be made to work. Maybe she can, but you know, that is one thing to keep in mind, is that some people did use her in PvE. I used her as a Banshee one-shot unit, but that's because I really had no other Banshee one-shot unit. Nowadays, with Rift around, most people are just farming Rift, and they're not really too focused on any specific hunt. And for newer players, well, there's a lot more free answers to Banshee than investing fully into Yufine. So overall, I think this change is a pretty good net positive, especially for the PvP aspect of things. But then again, that is another DPS cleave bridge unit that I have to look out for. So you can also run her on Merciless Glutton, by the way, which means after she kills somebody, she gets to push up the team's combat readiness. So she can bridge herself, but then she can also bridge the team. Okay, next up, Sinful Angelica. This is a pretty cool one as well. So instead of decreasing attack for 1 turn when she attacks with her S1, and then soul burning for some reason to decrease attack for 2 turns, now she has a 75% chance to defense break for a turn, and you can soul burn it to decrease defense for 2 turns. That is pretty good, with a 100% chance to boo, no 85 shenanigans, nothing like that, right? The thing is, it doesn't ignore resist, so if you want her to deal good, consistent defense breaks, you might want to build some effectiveness on her. I probably wouldn't recommend it. Probably just defense break some sort of DPS or low effect res unit, right? You still want to build her with effect resistance, and you probably still want some bulk. So here's what changed with her passive. Instead of when the caster's immortal, enemies can't be revived, she just has a straight up passive like Bryceria. But it's better than Bryceria's, because it's one-sided. Bryceria prevents both players from reviving. Sinful Angelica prevents the enemies from reviving only. So you can use her with things like Ruel and other stuff. You can use her with your own Arbiter Vildreds and things, and she will let them revive. Your opponents, though, not so much. Now, with her S3 here, she actually, instead of just dispelling 1 debuff from all allies, she dispels 2, which is great because debuffs are becoming increasingly more common. So units like Singelica or any Soul Weaver out there really needs higher cleansing capabilities in order to keep up. But this also means that you don't need to rely on immortality for Sinful Angelica to kind of do her thing. You don't really need to build her with a whole ton of effect resistance. I mean, I guess if you build her super fast and squishy, you might. But if you build her slower and bulkier and super tanky with some healing artifact or something to go along with her S1, like Celestine, or even like a Guardian Ice Crystals, for example, she can probably stay on the field for quite a while, and the immortality will just be the cherry on top, right? It's another thing for your opponent to deal with, and if you don't need to stack like up to 300 resist on her. If you even have 200 resist, it'll be kind of tricky for some of your opponents to get rid of that, right? 150 to 200 resistance is still really tricky to debuff, because most people, if they're not running dedicated like debuffers, they're running, you know, anywhere from 0 to 100 effectiveness on most standard units, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Sinful Angelica, I might go ahead and build her up and just give her a shot. I might build her tankier though, and a little bit bulkier, slower, you know. We'll see how that plays out. Anyway, last two things here. We got the Artifact Balance Adjustment. So, for Emma Huayang coming out, that's right, just for Emma Huayang, I think, they're changing Sigurd Scythe. So, it used to be when you're below 50% health, you increase attack by 25%, and you get that extra, you know, absorb damage dealt as health. Now they're straight up just saying, no, you don't need to be below 50% health for the damage increase. Now you're just increasing attack by anywhere from 10 to 20%. If you have a plus 15 Sigurd, you're going to have 15% attack. If you have a plus 30 Sigurd, it's going to be a 20% attack boost. That is really nice, but I would say this is more of a side grade because, again, you're not really getting the full 25%, right? You're not getting the full 25%. You have to max out the artifact to get the 20%. If it's maxed out, it's pretty much a straight upgrade, right? You get the increased damage all the time. It is really good. Okay, I'm not saying this change is bad, but if you have a plus 15 version at 15% attack, I don't know, some units I feel could just benefit from the 25% when they're below 50% health, right? So things like ML Ken, for example, would have been nice. He is one of the units I have on, like, let's say a plus 15 Sigurd. I don't have enough plus 30s to go around. I only have one copy of that. So yeah, be mindful of who you put the Sigurd Scythe on, because it is really nice now, this increased attack. And it's much more consistent, right? So you no longer have to be scared of Sigurd Scythe users when they're below 50% health. Now you always have to fear them, because they're absolutely insane, okay? So yeah, moving on here, Eligos' artifact, last thing to get changed, an offer you can't refuse. So, when he attacks with a single target attack, you can penetrate the target's defense by 10 to 20%, right? It's kind of made for him because all of his skills are single target, but you could potentially use this on other units. It used to be when defeating an enemy with a single target attack, it increases combat readiness of the ally with the highest combat readiness, except for the caster, by 10 to 20%. So it was a bridge artifact, right? If you use Eligos and you killed, it's kind of like Merciless Glutton, but instead of pushing up the entire team, just pushes up the next in line. So, you know, Eligos would go, push up the next in line would go, hopefully push up the rest of your team, all that good stuff. But now it's been changed to when targeted with single target attack, you still have that penetration here, but after attacking with a single attack, when the target receives damage equivalent to 50% more of their max health, you have up to a 100% chance to increase combat readiness of all allies by 15%, and this can be applied once per turn. So with Eligos having faster turn cycling, this is kind of good, you can proc this very often, but for some reason Pirate Captain Flan had to have her thing be 3 turns. Anyway, this can proc every turn. Yeah, with an offer you can't refuse here. Well, yeah, when anyone is below 50% health, it's pretty easy to achieve. Again, with things like CO and stuff, setting you up with a lot of free damage out the gate. This combat readiness is pretty good. 15% combat readiness is very solid for everybody and not just the next in line. That's good. But the downside is now you have to have a plus 30 artifact. And I don't think a lot of people have that laying around. Eligos wasn't a unit people just pulled multiple copies of just for fun. But yeah, that is going to be it for the balance adjustment preview, guys. That is a lot of information to sit back and digest. Who do I think are the biggest winners? I think Eligos definitely got you know, a pretty good change, right? And I guess second place might be Archdemon. I want to say it's Archdemon. She seems pretty interesting, and I kind of look forward to testing her out here. As for the biggest losers, I mean, things like Chloe you can argue are not used in PvP and such, but just knowing what could have been is probably why this hurts so much. So Pirate Captain Flan, I'm so sorry. But yeah, this is my overall summary here with Pirate Captain Flan is that, like, I'm a little disappointed to see that so many units are getting this treatment where you're getting this, like, extra combat readiness boost, and it mostly is being used as bridge units for very fast and aggressive teams. It can, I'm not saying it can't be, it can definitely be used in slower standard teams for turn cycling and such too, but I feel like just the tempo and pacing is starting to lean heavily on the aggressive side, at least with this current balance patch. But yeah, anyway, with that being said though, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.